Thank you for joining us on another edition of Against the Current, coming to you from the Skyline Club atop the Old Republic building in downtown Chicago. Our guest on this installment of Against the Current is Judge Fred Foreman. Judge Foreman, thanks so much for joining us.
Good afternoon.
Appreciate it. So, not just a judge, I mean, just a quick CV, because there's so much here, so much history and texture and knowledge, but really a legal career that is unsurpassed in Illinois history, at least. Lake County State's Attorney for a decade, U.S. Attorney in the early 90s, 90 to 93,
Correct.
If I've got that right. Chief Judge, Lake County Circuit, 19th Sub-Circuit.
19th Judicial Circuit.
19th Judicial Circuit, excuse me. And now kind of all the way back to private practice on a senior counsel.
Okay. That and grandfather.
And grandfather, I reversed the order of importance. Yeah, obviously, my bad.
It's been a very interesting and challenging career, and I've been blessed to have moved in and out of the public sector. I spent a lot of time in private practice, both as a sole practitioner and a practicing attorney, and I'm back doing that now. So I've had both government service and service in the private sector.
But so Lake County State's Attorney, you were elected Lake County State's Attorney when you were a zygote. You were, right, like 11 years old or something?
I came in with the Reagan landslide in 1980. I was 32, one of the younger state's attorneys, and very close, defended or upset an incumbent at that time in the office, and served 3 terms as state's attorney until I was tapped by President Bush to become the United States Attorney for the Northern District.
And so in the kind of the pantheon of famed U.S. attorneys for the Northern District up here in Chicago, Dan Webb and Anton Valukas, you, Patrick Fitzgerald, so many others, now Zach Farden. One of the things I just kind of want to get your perspective on at the outset is, you know, being a state's attorney, elected, it's a political position in part. Being a U.S. attorney, you're in Chicago in the Northern District. There's a sort of a political culture up here in Chicago in the state of Illinois. In addition to you being considered and thought highly of along the road for all kinds of other higher public offices, U.S. Senate, even governor. I wonder if you could give a little bit of perspective on how you think politics has changed from when you were a state's attorney, a newly minted state's attorney in Lake County in 1980, to where we find ourselves today with kind of Governor Rauner and actually guys you were familiar with in 1980, Mike Madigan and John Cullerton, because they were in the General Assembly then, just as they are now. How you think the politics and the political culture in Chicago and Illinois has changed, or maybe not changed?
Well, I think, as I said, I came in with the Ronald Reagan revolution, and I was very active right away after my first term in the National District Attorneys Association, which took me to Washington, and I sort of caught the Potomac fever out there. Got to know Attorney General Meese very well, and a lot of other people in the administration, and became president of the National District Attorneys Association. So I testified at some of the confirmation hearings for Robert Bork and Anthony Kennedy.
Oh boy,
and
that's in the news all of a sudden again, isn't it?
Savored that experience, and of course, as United States Attorney, had to go through confirmation myself. But when I look back, the 1980s were certainly the golden years for the Republican Party in Illinois and in Lake County, the collar counties, because Governor Thompson, a former U.S. attorney, was the governor. Most of the office holders were elected Republicans, and that whole 10-year period and into the 90s were strong years for the Republican Party. Obviously, with the George Ryan era gone, and then the last almost 10 years of the Democrat presence in Springfield, things have changed a lot. I think Governor Rauner was elected because he was considered to be an independent Republican, a different brand of Republican, much like we're seeing on the national level. You're seeing a businessman that says he's going to come in. It's not going to be business as usual. He doesn't need political contributions because they're self-made people, and he's going to try and make some changes that I think are going to have to be implemented in order to correct the financial situation in Springfield.
With hindsight being 2020, do you look back at the 1980s, as you say, the kind of the salad years for the Republicans into the 90s, where there was control, even a 2-year interregnum there of the House, 94, the Gingrich Revolution, and say, boy, It was great. It was great to have governors. It was great to be in the majority, but we probably should have made some different policy choices than we made, because perhaps we sowed the seeds of the rise of Democrats, even the likes of Blagojevich and Quinn, the same way that some are arguing we have sowed the seeds at the national level with Republican leadership in Congress for the rise of a Donald Trump.
Well, yeah, and one of the things that I did do politically also in the 80s was I was a delegate to the Republican National Convention in 84 and in 1988. So I participated, I was elected for that congressional district and participated in that whole process of selecting a president. And it was unique back then because Ronald Reagan had those 2 terms, and he wasn't supposed to be elected in the first place because they felt that he was an actor, but he had been a governor.
Amiable dunce.
Yes, that's what his opinion was, but the people liked him. He said things the people liked, and so when it came time for him to finish his second term, another unique situation arose with Vice President Bush. He would have been the first vice president elected after a 2-year term of a Republican president in years. So there was something that was unique about that. I was a Bush delegate, a Bush quail, and I was able to participate in the process, which put me in a position at that time to become the United States Attorney, because those federal appointments, whether it's the United States Attorney or any of the other top federal appointments, are political appointments. It's the way they've always been.
Right, and so, but I mean, thinking about at the state level, the decisions of a Governor Thompson, the decisions of Governor Edgar on some of the issues that bedevil us today, like our unfunded pension liabilities, and thinking about Governor Edgar's pension ramp in '94. Decisions that, boy, if you look back and say, it may have seemed like good decisions at the time or politically expedient decisions at the time, or the kind of compromises we were always told by the Chicago media we're supposed to make. But those compromises started to sow the seeds not of the public policy problems we face, but also of Republicans finding themselves in the super minority in the General Assembly, which has presented a particular challenge to Governor Rauner, even after 15 years of Chicago Democrat hegemony.
Well, I think back then times were good. I mean, times were good during the Reagan years, and actually times were good during the Bill Clinton years in Washington, too. At the same time, the Republicans were taking over with Newt Gingrich here in Illinois. We had a change in the House with Lee Daniels, and his group came in, too. So there was an opportunity to make those changes, but I don't really recall people being that concerned about it back then. I felt that they felt that they.
Some people aren't concerned about it today.
No, that's what I mean.
The slow burners.
They didn't appreciate how this was going to, increase. In fact, when you talk about, for instance, the argument over the 3% COLA that was passed back during that Thompson administration, I can recall, and I've read a little bit about those debates, and you're talking about a time when your CDs were paying 15%.
Yeah, right.
And Social Security cost of living increases were like 5%. And I can remember them talking about, well, 5% seems to be a lot. Let's settle on 3%. So I think there was some, at least they recognized that there was going to be some issues going forward.
And so, thinking about the politics of it just a little bit more, part of the question that is asked sometimes, have these conversations with the media types, is who watches the Watchmen? Who watches the Watchmen in media? Who provides oversight of the media to make sure that they're not in the tank for one side or the other? They're not trying to drive a particular point of view while pretending to be objective scriveners. Well, the same thing could be said of the judiciary. The same thing, we talk a lot about the city of Chicago alderman who gets picked off for taking a $500 bribe, or even in this state, unfortunately, governors who are doing all kinds of nefarious activities and wind up in federal prison. But the judiciary, and you were involved in the seminal investigation and prosecution of some 90 corrupt public officials, largely in the Cook County Judiciary, Operation Greylord in the 80s. Just kind of distill that case, that prosecution a little bit, that operation and that prosecution, or those prosecutions a little bit. And also, now fast forwarding almost 30 years, who watches the Watchmen today?
Well, as state's attorney in Lake County, I had several opportunities to be involved with the federal government on joint investigations. So I sort of learned how that process worked. I was aware of the Greylord investigation that started in 1981. Actually, the investigation started earlier than that under the United States Attorney Tom Sullivan in '79. It was indicted when Dan Webb was U.S. Attorney in '81, and continued with other superseding indictments, which went after the most of the traffic division in the Cook County State's Attorney's or Cook County court system, but also went into the Chancery Division and some in the Law Division. So that was the initial emphasis.
Judges taking bribes.
Yes, and a large group of judges that were involved in it, and a lot of them were political appointees, and they did not, many of them did not attend to their court duties, and it was a mess, and everybody knew it was a mess. So it then led to a subsequent investigation. You felt the Greylord would be a deterrent. It didn't deter everybody, and the subsequent investigation, which I was more involved with than the tail end of Greylord, and that was Operation Gambat, which looked both at the Chancery Division in Cook County as well as the City Council. Involved was Alderman Rhodey and Senator DiArco, and then the presiding judge of the Chancery Division at that time, David Shields. There were other judges that were indicted, and the seriousness here was that organized crime, and particularly organized street crime, street gangs, the street crews that were part of the traditional organized crime were involved in payoffs in the judicial system.
So you're talking about the outfit combined with the big street gangs at the time, like
Yes.
the El Rukns,
The Gangster Disciples, Vice Lords, that whole, basically the corporate structure gangs, different than many of the gangs we have now, which are more of an entrepreneurial gang out there. But the structure of those large gangs and organized crime was run much like successful corporations.
So, so all these judges go to jail. Some aldermen go to jail. The outfit's involved. The outfit today, 30 years later, isn't what it was in the 80s, at least by most people's accounts. But what about? But the first thing you said is most of these judges were political appointees. Well, it is the worst kept secret in Illinois politics that if you want a judgeship in Cook County Circuit Court, you have to get the blessing of Mike Madigan or Ed Burke or both. So have we exchanged kind of one form of undue influence for another?
No, I think the couple of changes that came out of the Solovey Commission, Jerry Solovey from Jenner and Block, they realized that they wanted to compensate judges much like they did with the federal bench here in Chicago. They wanted to make sure that they could attract quality individuals so that they wouldn't be necessarily coming out of a political system. They would be coming out of better firms. They would be from law enforcement. And the Supreme Court, I think, have instituted now the education conference and really more of a merit selection, which actually is merit election, because the Supreme Court on a vacancy will make an appointment, and most of the vacancies that are filled by associate judges at the circuit level that have been selected by circuit judges at the local level. So you have more of a merit selection. You're hoping that you can balance the politics of the situation, because they are elected offices, with the recommendations of the bar associations and pretty comprehensive background investigations on the judges.
No, the Tribune has been opining on this for years, for merit selection for the circuit court, as opposed to, I go to my ballot on March 15th or the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, and I see 70 judges whose names I've never heard of, and they all happen to have Irish surnames, shockingly, even today. And so they, have this be some kind of panel of legal experts, those that know the judges, know their legal record, know their credentials, know their kind of intellectual capacities, work ethic, and those things, rather than leaving it up to the voters, because it still provides for a bit of a fiefdom, a patronage fiefdom in the legal community for Democrat power brokers like Madigan and Burke. Is that a good idea? I mean, this is a bit of an esoteric idea, but it turns out to be really important, particularly if you ever have to appear before a circuit court judge on a range of matters. Is that a good idea, or do you think that per Greylord there's enough of a deterrent effect and some of the reforms you mentioned that have had lasting impact that's not necessary?
Well, I think there's been a deterrent effect, and I think that we have a better quality of judiciary, and I think that the Supreme Court has taken a position and has placed the emphasis on administration by chief judges, which I served, is that if you have misconduct by a judge in your courthouse, if you don't report it, then you're responsible as well. So there is accountability and discipline, and I think it's with the Judicial Inquiry Board, with greater financial disclosure that the judges have to file the very detailed forms once a year on their financial disclosures. So I think there is more of that, and I think that the bar associations have looked very closely and have ranked the judges based on their qualifications, so that you're hoping to elect the most qualified judges. But I don't think we're going to have the merit selection per se like they would have in the federal bench. Here I think we're going to be, as long as the laws don't change, you're going to have hopefully merit election, and you're going to have judges required, like the judges now, are to go to training every 2 years and to have their continuing legal education. And I think the Supreme Court's done a pretty good job. And having served as a member of the Conference of the Chief Judges that meet with the Supreme Court on a monthly basis, they dictated to the Chief Judges what they expect from them as far as being the watchman on the local watch on the local circuits.
So the cliche about, you get a judicial appointment or you run for judge as a means to retire, is that unfair?
Is what?
Is that unfair that you get, you go to Madigan or Burke, or you get a judicial appointment, you stand for election, you get elected to be a circuit court judge, that's the means to retire and just enjoy the good life and work from 1 to 115? Is that an unfair caricature?
I don't think it is anymore. I don't really think. I think that there's more input by the various bar associations. And I think there's still, obviously, since we have elections, you're going to have people, whether it's Cook County or the other counties, are going to be involved. I'm involved in mentoring and looking for good judicial candidates myself now. I'm very active still in judicial organizations to make sure that we do get quality people. And I think that, for instance, in Lake County, we have our first Hispanic chief judge up there right now that's serving. We've had 3 women chief judges in Lake County. So I think it's important to have the diversity. I think it's important, though, particularly to have the retention elections, because if a judge is not doing the job, then he's got to stand before the voters in 6 years to be retained.
Now, going back to something else you said about Greylord, about the influence of street gangs and some of the corruption that occurred on the bench. Think fast forwarding to where we are now with the level of violent crime in the city of Chicago. It isn't like it was in the 80s, but that's because crime has declined nationally in the last 30 years, but Chicago's still higher murder per capita rate than New York and LA combined. The Rukns, the Gangster Disciples you mentioned, these were kind of forerunners maybe to some of the Mexican drug cartels. Or Colombian drug cartels. I mean, these, as you were saying, these were like vertically integrated corporations, for example, that Jeff Fort ran with the Rukns. What's the experience of prosecuting those criminal enterprises, those street gangs that are responsible for so much violence on the west side of the city or the south side of the city, that is applicable today? What is it that the policymakers and political leaders today haven't learned from what happened in the 80s to stop the violence associated with these street gangs?
Well, when I was United States Attorney, there was a Department of Justice initiative called Weeden See. And what this initiative was, it sounds sort of a catchy title, but Weeden See meant weed out the crime influences and then reseed it, with positive influences. And there was a coordinated effort here in Chicago targeting the South Side with the projects on the South Side. Ida B. Wells, Robert Taylor Homes, right down by Comiskey Park.
Yeah, sure.
And there was a targeting area. We had major raids, helicopters. The Attorney General came in, and I actually was on one of these raids as U.S. Attorney with then Alderman Bobby Rush. And elevator opened, there was a drug deal going on right in our presence, and the community was involved. The community wanted these places cleaned out. And
yeah, that's an interesting point. Let me just stop you there, because part of it, and you see this in the presidential campaign right now. Black liberation theologists like Cornel West talking about I'm for Bernie Sanders because Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton passed the crime bill in the early 90s. And it turns out, if you actually trace the history of stiffer laws for drug-related crimes. Like you go back to the Rockefeller years in New York, and it was the black community working with Nelson Rockefeller in New York. They wanted stiffer sentences because they wanted those thugs, the street gang members, the drug traffickers, they wanted them out of their neighborhood. So it was, we're kind of, there's a bit of revisionist history about who supports getting street gangs and drug traffickers off their streets. It turns out that minority communities, the majority of law-abiding minorities in some of these neighborhoods, they were the impetus for a lot of the stiffer penalties that were imposed by U.S. attorneys like yourself.
Well, and the other thing, I had the support of the Department of Justice, you know, with this program to come in, and we had the authority to go into these areas and to use the racketeering statutes to work with local law enforcement. Also back then, Chicago PD, they were as tough as nails in these neighborhoods, and they had gang crimes people in there that talked with the community, got information from the community, and turned it over to the drug task forces. I mean, it was coming in naturally. Drugs were coming into the country, and they were being filtered into the neighborhoods. But I had a very unique relationship with Mayor Daley. He and I had been state's attorneys together. We knew each other well. We traveled together. He was very active with the National District Attorneys Association, and he knew the people in the Reagan and the Bush administrations, and he knew they would assist if he requested it. But the other thing that was going on back then was that the city of Chicago, in the Loop, there was improvements being made in the Loop. Mayor Daley focused on economic development in the Loop, doing a lot of things that Giuliani did in New York, where he wasn't going to let the people come into the city and be hassled by people on the street. A lot of those people were put into shelters. They were taken care of. But they looked at the west side. They looked at the Chicago Stadium, the United Center on the west side. They looked at the Loop, and they looked at the White Sox Park. And they decided that in these areas where their crime was just becoming intolerable, that they were going to have economic development. At the same time, they were cracking down on the gang structures. And that's actually what happened over that time. From the Loop to the west side, from the Loop to the south side, including McCormick Place and the Bears at Soldier Field, these sports franchises and the people that were involved in them, and the businessmen and women in the area, the chambers of commerce, they all got together and said, we've got to have economic development. Look what it is today. So when you start to take this whole issue of crime in the streets today, the gangs today are different. Whether they're Waukegan or Chicago, Joliet, or in the suburbs. They still deal in heroin, but it's the heroin is not going into the inner city, it's going to the suburbs. We have an epidemic of overdoses of heroin in the suburban areas now. Yeah. We never had that before.
That's right.
So I think what you're looking at now is you're looking at entrepreneurial. I mean, you have a different gang leadership or representation in each neighborhood. The neighborhoods are separate.
You're saying you don't have
they're not cohesive anymore.
You don't have the kingpins like a Jeff Ford.
Everybody is an entrepreneur, you know, and you know, one of the things back in the 90s, in the 80s and 90s, there were 1,000 homicides a year in Chicago. There's about 450. That's way too many, but many people attribute, not only has crime gone down, a lot of people are incarcerated, a lot of people that were committing a lot of crimes are behind bars, but also a lot of the people that were admitted to the emergency rooms, the techniques that came back from the war in the Middle East, they used them in emergency rooms on shootings. People were shot now and they're safe. They don't die anymore. Right. I mean, the doctors and the nurses and the emergency personnel have done wonders.
Yeah, but again, right, from the 80s to today in terms of aggregate numbers, but you have to look at it in context, and the context is Chicago versus other major urban centers today, and Chicago still is an outlier. There's still something happening here that's not happening elsewhere. So you mentioned the difference between the gangs in the 80s versus today. What about the difference in terms of law enforcement and prosecutorial cooperation from the 80s till today? Is there some different approach? Is there something that isn't as cohesive, isn't as cooperative as it should be that helps to explain this in part? Is there not enough police? Are the police tactics different? What is it that is different in Chicago today as compared to LA, New York, Houston, et cetera?
Well, the only thing I can say is that I think there's a sense that there needs to be more of an alliance between the police and the people that live in the communities. I mean, the police have to be in the communities. They have to be doing active, proactive crime control in the communities like they did. I mean, community policing came in back in the 80s and the 90s, and I think that seemed to work. Maybe they're using that in New York and LA. Although in the 90s, we had people detailed from Chicago to go to LA, prosecutors and law enforcement, to assist in some of the problems they were having back then. So I think that we had a good model then. I think they're struggling to find that model today.
So speaking of alliances, the relationship between the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District and the Attorney General of the United States, the Attorney General of the State of Illinois. And I bring this up because Lisa Madigan, who's been our Attorney General for the better part of the last 13 years, said when she first ran in 2002 against Joe Burkett, coming off of Jim Ryan's tenure as Attorney General, that one of the things that she would do that Republicans failed to do was root out public corruption. Where was Jim Ryan when the George Ryan corruption was going on? And 13 years later, she doesn't have a lot of successful prosecutions of public officials, corrupt public officials, to show for her efforts, and there have been quite a few in 13 years in Illinois, as there always have been in that period of time. And so I guess the question is, well, I should point out that her rationale or her explanation is, well, in most of those cases, take Blagojevich for instance, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District got involved, and so I didn't want to step on their feet. That's been her her explanation. Is that a fair explanation? And what is the relationship between a U.S. Attorney for the Northern District, which you were, and the Attorney General, regardless of party? You were a U.S. Attorney for the Northern District when Roland Burris, a Democrat, was Attorney General, and Neil Hartigan, a Democrat, was Attorney General before him. So what of that relationship and Lisa Madigan's explanation for her kind of AWOL status over the last 13 years?
Well, actually, that relationship with the U.S. Attorney, the Cook County State's Attorney, and the Attorney General has been the same for as long as I can remember. I mean, they've carved out their turf. The U.S. Attorney was going to handle public corruption and federal corruption at that level. The Attorney General was going to be more involved with state prosecutions for environmental matters, for regulatory matters and issues.
And the consumer advocate.
Yeah, exactly, and that's been the traditional role. The other thing that attorney generals have become very active in, obviously, is taking on major industries. I mean, as far as tobacco litigation, that was the attorney generals, and they've taken on various charities they go after for violation of those issues or those laws, and the Attorney General was always considered to be the chief law enforcement officer, but his role was always in that bailiwick, whereas the U.S. Attorney used to rotate every 4 years. Pat Fitzgerald was the only U.S. Attorney that ever served more than one term in modern history, because he was focused on the public corruption at the state and the local level. And that's why both presidents left him in as long as they did. So he really assumed that role. When I served as United States Attorney, our role was to focus on the federal crimes, particularly public corruption, judicial corruption. The Attorney General worked with the local state's attorneys, oftentimes came in and prosecuted cases where they had conflicts and the local state's attorneys couldn't do it. So that's a traditional role, and I think most attorney generals, when they run for office, said they're going to, as a part of their platform, we're going to do more public corruption cases.
But when attorney generals, regardless of party, say that, they're being a little disingenuous.
Well, they're making a campaign promise that they probably aren't going to keep.
Because it's just not.
It has never traditionally been their role.
In practice, it turns out not to be their role.
Exactly.
So, law enforcement is a stepping stone, springboard to higher office, to governorship. Governor Jim Thompson leveraged his status as U.S. Attorney to the governorship for 4 terms. Mayor Daley, obviously, right? He had a little bit of other things going on that assisted him. Mayor Giuliani in New York, sure. Fred Foreman, back in the day when he was U.S. Attorney, was widely rumored to be, okay, this guy needs to take on Paul Simon, then the sitting U.S. Senator. This guy needs to be Lieutenant Governor for Jim Edgar. This guy needs to be governor himself someday. So you chose the path somewhat less traveled and stayed in the legal community than going on to be a judge, as we've talked about before. What about political ambitions and the kind of thinking back to those years in the early 90s where you were kind of one of a handful of people that was routinely talked about for every vacancy for statewide office that occurred? Any regrets, considerations? What was the calculus at the time?
Well, I was flattered to be considered, let me say that, and from a high-profile position as U.S. Attorney. But George Bush lost the election in 1992, and at that time there wasn't any available job openings, and I had a young family that needed to be prepared for college and college tuition. And every time an opportunity came up, someone was a little bit ahead of me in line. Jim Ryan took advantage.
It wasn't a lack of desire necessarily.
Not at all. Not at all. It was just a question of Jim Edgar was elected governor, and he looked to be there for quite a while. Jim Thompson had just left the governorship. They were talking about him for president of the United States. He was very much considered for that position. Eventually, when Jim Edgar retired early, George Ryan was there. He'd been Secretary of State. He was very popular. And Jim Ryan was teed up, and I was a supporter of Jim Ryan. So I had alliances that, I remained very active in politics, but I continued to focus on the profession, the legal profession. I practiced law. I had a good run for 11 years at the Freeborn and Peters law firm. And then I went on the bench because I always wanted to finish my career as a judge. I've now finished my career as a judge, but I'm back again practicing law. So opportunities were there, but when I had to weigh the opportunity of running for higher office and that investment with my family, and my kids were at that age where they were all getting ready for college, and I had a lot of friends that were still in government, and I knew what my goals were, and that's why I still remain active in trying to make sure we get good judges in that third branch of government.
Do you think it was a different time 25 years ago, too, in terms of the political culture where, because Republicans were ascendant in that time period, as you described earlier, that it was more of a kind of wait your turn? There's slots, and everybody comes together and figures out, we're going to put the square peg in the square hole and the round peg in the round hole over here, where today it's a little bit more wide open.
I agree. That's a very good assessment of the way it is today, because nobody wants to wait in line anymore. Nobody wants to wait for their time. And
is that a good or a bad thing?
Well, I'm not so sure, because you look at the current another former U.S. attorney that did quite well is Christie. Maybe his time was not now. Because as a former U.S. attorney myself, I probably would have been in his court, but he probably waited a little bit too long. And then I think just the impression that people had, he was a tough talker, but he was a bit of a bully, and I think he lost a lot on that. And but there's another time, the governors that are running this year, these are traditionally Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton. You look at the people that have been elected to the highest office in the country over the past 50 years. They've either been a United States Senator, LBJ, JFK, President Obama, or they've been a governor, some of which never distinguished themselves as much as they probably could have. The ones that lost, Senator McCain, Bob Dole, during that period of time, they were senators, but who do they lose to? They lost to governors.
Yeah, it seems like it's a bit of a different age too. Particularly in the kind of the 24-hour news cycle, and this really predates your time at U.S. Attorney's Office, as the U.S. Attorney, I should say, by a little bit. Where Scott Walker is a good example, it seems, this cycle. Maybe some other candidates, even Jeb Bush. You can be very good at retail politics, even at a statewide level, even in a big state like Florida or Illinois, like Jim Thompson was. But if you're not good on TV, if you can't exist in the 24-hour cable news channel world, then you're going to have a very, very difficult time, no matter how good your record is.
Well, I'm a Wisconsin taxpayer. I have another home in Door County, Wisconsin. So yeah. I was a big fan of Scott Walker. My daughter's in education in Wisconsin. She's got her master's, and she works in schools, and she likes Scott Walker. She was a beneficiary of some of the reforms that took place that seemed to work very well and continue to working well. So I was very much in favor of Scott Walker, but he hit the nail on the head. He just didn't have that ability. Look what happens to Senator Rubio with one 20-minute duration of a debate
Yeah.
with a former prosecutor, putting the pressure on, and he lost his momentum just on that. And maybe he's regained it, maybe he's not. But I think that's tough hardball politics. And with that kind of a news cycle and the media focusing on making it competitive, that's what happens.
Do you think that it's my contention that the law follows culture, right? So the law is reflective of culture because, frankly, politicians are usually at the end of the parade route, not the beginning of it. Yeah. They make decisions after they figure out which way the public's going. They're not usually leading the parade. And so do you think that there's not enough conversation, thought in the Republican Party devoted to our culture because the culture drives the law than there should be, rather than just saying, follow the law, follow the law, follow the law, follow the law, abide the law, abide the law, abide the law. That's always the solution, to the exclusion of a deeper conversation about political culture.
Well, I think it's got to be culture and policy, too, because I think that one simple value that we should have with the law and with politics is the rule of law. I mean, if the rule of law, I'm a judge, okay, I have to follow the law. All right, I have to apply the law to the facts, and if I don't, I have an appellate court that's going to come down on me and say, you didn't handle this properly, or a Supreme Court. So I think that if you have an issue in our society, if you follow the law, many times that will clear up your issue. But when you start to defer judgment, or you decide that you're going to postpone dealing with that issue, pretty soon you haven't dealt with an issue, and it's become such a big issue because you've delayed it, you haven't confronted it, that it becomes a stumbling block, which can, I think, will stop your political progression.
How much of an accountability mechanism or a chastening mechanism, perhaps, are higher courts? I mean, in other words, as a circuit court judge, even the chief judge, if you get overturned at the appellate court level, I mean, it's not like you lose your job. You still get your paycheck. What's the perspective of judges in terms of thinking about a higher courts overturning their holding?
Well, if you really are proud of the job you're doing as a judge, you don't want to be reversed because it's set right out. I mean, you are graded publicly, and even what they used to call the Rule 23s, which were unpublished opinions, they're getting published. So the Second District Appellate Court that I dealt with and the Supreme Court, if you've done something wrong, they're going to point it out, and you're going to be held accountable. And in the states where you have to run for re-election as a judge, the first thing they look at, Wisconsin being an example, is your opinions and the appellate opinions, your performance as a judge. And I know when I was chief judge, if I had a judge that was reversed by the appellate court and it was because that judge wasn't prepared or that judge was cavalier about his responsibilities, he was in my office. I was told him, I said, this reflects poorly on the whole circuit. And frankly, it's right down the line. Supreme Court will tell the same thing to the chief judges. You have a responsibility to make sure that your judges are held accountable for either misconduct or the fact that they're dereliction in duty.
Just your role, I mean, U.S. Attorney's role is interesting, and that's much more of a public role. But as the chief judge of a circuit, most people experience court when they have to go pay a speeding ticket, right? They don't. Most people are not experiencing court because they've committed some kind of serious crime, or because even they're serving on a jury necessarily. And so I just wonder what the experience is, what people should understand about how the circuit courts work, the job that is done at that level, versus what they see from salacious dramatizations on the silver screen or on television.
Well, I've prosecuted people in court all the way from speeding tickets to capital murder. I've been a judge in those type of cases, and I've selected people for jurors to serve in cases that would to many people not seem important. But when the jurors come in, and I go talk to the jurors after their service back in my chambers, and I talk to them what they thought about the system and the case. It may have been a theft case or a burglary case, not a murder case, and they are so excited about the fact that they participated in the process. In the same regard, if someone goes to court on a traffic case, and that's the first time you've been to court, I don't care who you are. You're nervous. You're upset. That's the most important thing. People that go into court and are having their houses foreclosed, I mean, that is an experience that's almost like surgery.
Yeah.
I mean, nowadays, with our economy and the impact it's had, I was telling you earlier, picking a jury during the recession in 2006, 2007, I had jurors that were in tears because they had so many problems at home. They wanted to be a juror, but they couldn't. They couldn't serve because they had a sick child or they were unemployed. And but then others would say, no, I don't care, I got to serve. I have to do my duty.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like, it took me about 40 times in court for speeding tickets before I got comfortable. But now I'm comfortable after the amount of speeding tickets I've gotten. But to that point, so this is another caricature, right? You know, you're too dumb to get out of jury duty, and it turns out that maybe that's a little bit unfair. That people that are selected for jury, number one, they want to do it, and not just for the per diem, but because they believe in the system, they want to understand the system, they want to learn the system, they take the job seriously. So your experience on the bench with all of your legal experience was an edifying one for you?
Absolutely. I mean, it was
in terms of belief in the system.
Jurors would come in and they would say, I have to serve. My son's in Afghanistan or Iraq, and he's serving there, I'm serving here.
Yeah.
And I was on jury duty, and a former Waukegan detective was on jury duty. He came over to me, and he said, what are you doing here? You know, my picture's up on the wall, and I'm on jury duty. And I says, I'm on jury duty. He says, well, what kind of a judge are you? You can't even get out of jury duty.
Right, yeah, right.
So I think that that's a strict rule. You know, you get selected for jury duty, you go to jury duty.
Well, it's funny, when Governor Rauner was just candidate Rauner in 2014, his number got called for jury duty. He went to jury duty. There was a story about it, right? He went to jury duty. He didn't get selected, but he showed up to jury duty and went through the process just like anybody else. And that's one of the great kind of leveling aspects of our justice system, is that it doesn't matter if you're a governor or a former U.S. attorney or a Waukegan detective or anybody, that you all go through the same process. And there's something that is unifying about that process, and maybe that's what generates, number one, people taking that very seriously, and number two, as imperfect as it is, the best justice system in the world.
Well, you can mention this to your co-host Amy in the morning.
Yes,
that we once had Mike Kaplan, who was a weatherman at Channel 7 ABC, well known from Lake County. He was on one of my juries, a criminal case, and he came in and sat there every day and did his time. He talked about it several times afterwards about what a great experience it was. But then he came back with Jackie Bang, and they cut a orientation video on jury duty, because they'd both been on jury duty, and Jackie's married to a Lake County judge. So they came back and they just were delighted to do that. And we show it now to the jurors during orientation. It shows it doesn't really matter who you are. You know, you're here to serve, and you're just not going to get out of jury duty.
We've got to get your take, because of this legal career that we've described, on the position, and somebody who's gone through a Senate confirmation hearing, as you mentioned at the outset, with respect to being confirmed to be a U.S. attorney, on the Senate Republican position on President Obama promulgating a nominee to replace Justice Scalia, and their position that no hearings will be held regardless of the nominee that you level up to us. This is something that should wait for the next president. Ultimately, isn't this a political process? And so all of the hue and cry from Democrats, because they don't have the Senate, is just political hue and cry. If they were in a position where they did control the Senate, they would do something very differently than and say something very differently than they're saying now. If they had a Republican president, the arguments would be reversed, essentially, as they have been historically with Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer and the New York Times and everyone else, going even back to the Bork hearings. What's your opinion on that? Because our junior senator, Republican Mark Kirk, is one of the few that has broken from the ranks and suggested that President Obama should put forward a nominee, which of course he will, and that the Senate should take up that nominee.
Well, I was a little surprised that the Senate acted so quickly. You know, the Saturday that Justice Scalia died, they said they wouldn't entertain a nomination. I mean, if you look at the Constitution, the president can send a nomination over, and then the Senate can decide whether or not, under the broad interpretation of advised consent, how they're going to handle that nomination. I think what Senator Kirk tried to say is, well, let's see who you're going to send over. You know, I'll keep an open mind till I see who your nominee is, and then, of course, they've now decided there will not be any hearings. And I don't know if that means any more hearings for pending nominations, because when I was nominated, there were a couple senators who did not want a particular person confirmed as a federal judge. So they essentially politically, John Sununu was the chief of staff, there was a brick on a pile stacked on his desk of nominations. And the nominations under that brick, who was somebody else's file, were not going to move until that was dealt with. Yeah, you know, it took my nomination almost 9 months to get confirmed.
And did they explore your video rentals the way they explored Judge Bork's video rentals?
Full-fledged FBI background investigation.
The full colonoscopy.
And as I mentioned, as president of the National District Attorneys Association, I gave testimony both at the Bork confirmation hearings and with the Kennedy confirmation hearings as the president of the National District Attorneys. But once the nomination comes over, advice and consent gives the senators a lot of opportunities to do pretty much what they want to do, as long as they stay within the confines of the Constitution.
And isn't the watershed moment when Bork became a verb? When after Judge Bork got borked, which is now a part of our political parlance, isn't that what changed it? Where, hey, if we have the power, then we're going to exercise it. Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah, I think that it was a much more cordial, gentlemanlike, participatory process, and I think that had a lot to do with changing the rules of the game. And it's unfortunate. The Senate used to be much more collegial, and I think that's a lot of the frustration now in some of the presidential races. Is people want Washington. They want Washington to work. They're sending a lot of money out there. They want to see it work.
Well, so thinking about that and thinking about the presidential race, I mean, how do you, as a longtime political observer, locally, statewide, nationally, how do you explain the rise of Donald Trump as we sit here today? He's about this close from running the table and being the Republican nominee.
People are frustrated. They're frustrated with big government. They want more accountability, and Trump is saying a lot of things that people want to hear. I haven't heard too many plans as how he's going to carry out these particular plans, but that seems to be what people are looking at now. They're frustrated and they're angry.
And at the state level, I mean, you're Mr. Lake County. That's your moniker, one of your many monikers, Mr. Lake County. And it turns out,
I prefer Grandpa.
Well, right, again, Grandpa, you're right, the preeminent moniker. But it turns out that if you look at the numbers, just as we're looking at the numbers, the delegate math and so forth, the presidential, if you look at the numbers in Illinois at the state level, the Republican Party cannot be and will not be a majority party in the state if they're not a party of the suburbs. Collar counties like Lake County, which is frankly a 50-50 county these days. And so what do you think it is that Republicans need to do in Illinois that they haven't been doing to win races in the collar counties, like many races, legislative races in Lake County that they haven't won that are winnable? What do you think it is that Republicans need to do to be that majority party in the collar counties, again, in the suburbs, as the predicate to being the majority party in the state?
They have to have solutions. They have to have solutions to health care. They can't just say they're going to repeal Obamacare. They have to have an alternative. They have to have a plan. I think they have to have a plan for economic development. They have to have a plan to balance the budget. They have to have a plan for education. The largest expense on your tax bill is education, public education. So there has to be confidence in the educational system.
Do you think prosecutors make good executives, make good politicians at a statewide level, either Senate or governor? Or is it a mixed bag?
Well, most prosecutors, if they're successful, that means they've got good people that they can manage to make them successful. I mean, you have to be a good manager, but you have to hold people accountable, and you have to be willing to make a decision. You can't postpone a decision. And in any government that you manage people, I've taken the position that no matter what the organization is, 10% of the people are either incompetent or incapable of doing the job. And if you have to replace them, you have to be accountable and replace them. That's your job as an elected official or as a department head. They may very well be replaced by the same type of people, but that's a fact of management and skill at being a public manager. You know, I've had the opportunity to have wonderful people working for me when I've been state's attorney, United States attorney, and chief judge. And these people, you ask them to do something, they do it. If they don't do it, then you've got to hold them accountable.
So, you know, maybe sometime, you know, I mean, Bernie Sanders is like a 74-year-old socialist running for president and, you know, doing quite well. Maybe you got a statewide run in you left at some point? The statewide run that didn't happen in the early 90s when it could have happened?
I am delighted, like Bernie, to be a grandfather.
Yeah.
Bernie is very...
But not a socialist.
No. He's very entertaining, but that's what we have now here in the country. We have several senior citizens, all older than me, that are doing it. But at this point, no, I'm blessed to have, you know, a wonderful family and been married 45 years, and I'm lucky. I'm one of the survivors.
All right, he is Grandpa Fred Foreman, a former U.S. Attorney, former Lake County Chief Judge, now Senior Counsel at Freeborn Peters. Fred Foreman, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
You bet.
That was great. Thank you.